For 10 Christmases, my daughter left my grandchildren at my house, while she took her in-laws on a perfect family vacation. Every year I smiled and said, "Of course, sweetheart. Grandpa will take care of them." I thought I was helping the family I loved. But on the 10th Christmas, I arrived with gifts in my hands and heard my daughter say, "He's only here to watch the kids. He'll leave when we're done." I walked inside, saw something that broke my heart. And the next morning I bought a plane ticket and disappeared. Thank you for being here on Dad Family Revenge. It truly means everything. Before this story begins, leave a comment below what city or country are you joining us from today. Let's see how far this community reaches. A quick note. Some elements of this story are fictional, added for storytelling and educational purposes. Names and settings are not intended to represent anyone specific, but the message is one worth carrying with you. I've been living in Santa Fe for 14 months now, and I still haven't gotten used to the light. Back on Long Island, winter mornings were gray and heavy, the kind of gray that settles into your bones and stays there until April. But here in New Mexico, even in March, the sun comes up sharp and clean over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, pouring through the windows of this little coffee shop on Canyon Road, like it has somewhere important to be. I sit at the same table every morning, the one in the corner next to the window where the light hits just right and the coffee stays warm longer than it should. This morning a man sat down at the table beside mine. He looked to be around my age, maybe a few years younger, with the kind of easy, unhurried manner that people develop when they finally stopped rushing toward something. He glanced over at me, nodded the way strangers do in small towns, and then asked, "You live here long?" I turned the question over in my mind for a moment before I answered. "Long enough?" I said. He smiled, picked up his newspaper, and left me to my coffee and my thoughts. But the question stayed with me the way certain questions do. Long enough. Long enough for what exactly? Long enough to learn the names of the mountains. Long enough to find a grocery store I actually like. Long enough to stop waking up at 3 in the morning with my heart hammering in my chest, convinced I was still back on Long Island, still waiting for a phone call that would turn my stomach inside out. Long enough, I suppose, to finally feel like I belong somewhere. My name is Robert Callahan. Most people call me Bob. I'm 65 years old, and until 14 months ago, I had spent my entire adult life in Nassau County, Long Island, New York. I worked for 31 years as a licensed electrician, commercial buildings, mostly a few schools, a hospital renovation project in Hempstead that nearly killed my lower back and did kill my enthusiasm for confined spaces. I built a life there. A real one, with a house and a mortgage and a wife I loved more than I've ever been able to say out loud without my throat tightening up. Her name was Margaret. I keep her photograph in my wallet tucked behind my library card and in front of an old receipt I never throw away because it's from the last dinner we had together before she got sick. In the photo, she's standing in our backyard in October, squinting into the sun, laughing at something I said that I can't remember anymore. She had this laugh that started somewhere deep in her chest and worked its way up, the kind of laugh that made whatever room she was in feel 10 degrees warmer. Margaret passed away in the spring of 2018 after a fight with cancer that lasted 8 months and left me standing at her grave on a cold Tuesday in March, wondering how exactly a person is supposed to continue existing when the person who made existing feel worthwhile is gone. I won't pretend those first months were anything other than what they were. I rattled around that 3-bedroom house on Long Island like a marble in a shoebox. I forgot to eat. I bought groceries for 2 people out of pure muscle memory and then stood in the kitchen holding a second pork chop with absolutely nowhere to put it. But I got through it. Slowly, the way you get through things that seem impossible, one morning at a time, one cup of coffee at a time, one phone call at a time. And the phone calls, it turned out, were going to matter more than I realized. I have one daughter. Her name is Emily. She was 32 when Margaret died, already married to a man named Greg Moore, already living in a beautiful house in Manhasset with 2 kids of her own, my grandchildren Tommy and Lily. Tommy was 3 years old the first time I met him as a grandfather, rather than just a man at a holiday table. Lily was barely 1, all dark eyes, and grabbing hands and a laugh that reminded me painfully and wonderfully of her grandmother. When Margaret died, I told myself that Emily and those 2 kids were what I had left, that they were the reason to keep the house clean and the refrigerator stocked and the driveway shoveled when it snowed. I told myself that family was enough, that family was everything. I believed that with my whole heart. Margaret used to say something to me in the last weeks before she passed. She would reach over from her hospital bed and take my hand, and she would look at me with those steady brown eyes of hers, and she would say, "Promise me something, Bobby. Promise me you won't disappear into the background. Promise me you'll still take up space." I'd squeeze her hand and tell her of course I would. I lied, not on purpose. But I lied all the same, because what happened over the next 10 years, 10 Christmases, 10 Decembers, 10 versions of the same phone call from Emily chipped away at me in ways I didn't fully understand, until I was sitting in a car in my daughter's driveway on Christmas night, staring at the lit windows of her house, and finally admitting to myself that I had spent a decade becoming exactly the kind of man Margaret had begged me not to become. A man in the background. A man who took up no space at all. I wrap both hands around my coffee mug and look out the window at Canyon Road, at the adobe walls and the bare cottonwood trees, and the couple walking a dog the size of a small horse. My chest feels tight in a way that isn't quite pain, more like the ache of something that used to hurt very much and has mostly healed, but still reminds you it was there. For 10 years, my daughter called me every December with the same request. And for 10 years, I said yes. What happened after that 10th yes is the story I want to tell you. The first December without Margaret nearly broke me in half. I don't say that looking for sympathy. I say it because it's the truth, and the truth is the only thing I have left to offer at this point. The house on Long Island had never felt large when the 2 of us were in it. After she was gone, it felt enormous, every hallway too long, every room too quiet, every corner holding some small reminder that I couldn't bring myself to move. Her reading glasses on the nightstand, her handwriting on the grocery list still stuck to the refrigerator. A half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen table with her favorite blue pen sitting right beside it, cap off like she had just stepped away for a moment and would be back any second. She wasn't coming back. I knew that. But knowing something and feeling it are 2 entirely different things. And that December, I felt it in every single room of that house. I had taken to eating dinner in front of the television, which Margaret would have hated. She believed meals were for sitting at a table and talking to another human being, not staring at a screen while you shoveled food into your mouth. I could almost hear her voice when I settled onto the couch with a bowl of soup. "Bobby, what are you doing? Go sit at the table like a person." Some nights I actually got up and moved to the kitchen just to make that voice in my head stop. The call from Emily came on a Wednesday evening in early December. I was sitting at the kitchen table making Margaret happy from wherever she was eating leftover pasta and trying not to think about how quiet the house was. "Dad," Emily said, and her voice had that particular brightness to it, the kind that means good news is coming, or at least news that is being presented as good. "We're taking a little trip for Christmas this year. Greg's parents want to do something special. Would you be able to watch Tommy and Lily for a few days?" My heart jumped in my chest, not from surprise, but from something closer to relief. "Of course," I said, and I meant it with everything I had. Send them over whenever you need. You're the best dad. I mean it. After I hung up, I pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table and felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in months. The house wouldn't be empty. Tommy and Lily would be here with their noise and their needs and their absolute inability to let a grown man sit quietly and feel sorry for himself. That sounded like exactly what I needed. They arrived on the 23rd of December, Emily dropping them off with 2 overstuffed bags and a car seat and a list of instructions 3 pages long. Tommy was 3 years old and had recently discovered that the word "why" could be deployed as a weapon. Lily was 14 months, all wobbly legs and enormous eyes, and a grip on my index finger that made my throat ache in the best possible way. "You sure you've got this, Dad?" Emily asked, already halfway back to her car, her coat unbuttoned despite the cold. "We've got this," I said, holding Lily on my hip while Tommy tugged at my sleeve, demanding to know why the sky was blue. Emily smiled, waved, and drove away. I stood on the front porch, watching her taillights disappear around the corner, Lily warm and heavy against my side. Tommy's small hand finding mine without either of us thinking about it. The cold air stung my eyes and made them water, at least that's what I told myself at the time. Those 4 days were the best I'd had since March. We decorated the Christmas tree with ornaments that had been packed away since Margaret put them there the year before. I let Tommy eat cereal for dinner one night, which he treated like the greatest gift he had ever received. Lily learned to clap her hands sometime around noon on Christmas Eve, and she was so delighted with herself that she kept doing it for the next 2 hours, straight, laughing every single time, like it was new. I read them both to sleep on Christmas night, one on each side of me in the guest bed, their breathing slowing and deepening until the room felt full in a way it hadn't in a very long time. I didn't check Emily's social media that Christmas. I was too busy being grateful to wonder where exactly my daughter had gone for the holidays. That was my first mistake. The 2nd December, Emily called earlier. The 3rd December, earlier still. By the 4th year, I was half expecting the call before Thanksgiving was even over, and sure enough, my phone would ring right on schedule. Emily's voice bright and breezy, the same words arranged in the same order, the same cheerful certainty that I would say yes. And I always did. Every single time, without hesitation, without conditions, without asking a single question. I probably should have asked on year 1. But year 2 was when the cracks started showing. I just refused to look at them directly. It happened on a Sunday evening in late December of 2019. Tommy was 4, Lily was 2, and the 3 of us had spent the afternoon building a blanket fort in the living room that collapsed twice before we got it right. I had my phone on the kitchen counter, and when a notification buzzed, I picked it up without thinking. Emily had tagged Tommy in a photo. I clicked on it, expecting a picture of my grandson. What I got instead was an album. Emily had titled it "Christmas with Family," and there they were, bright and laughing against a backdrop of snow-covered mountains in Vermont. Emily in a red coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. Greg with his arm around her shoulders, grinning the way men grin when they know they've done something right. Frank and Patricia Moore. Greg's parents standing beside, looking relaxed and expensive in the way that people who summer in Connecticut always manage to look. And Tommy. My Tommy laughing on a ski slope, arms out wide like he was trying to catch the whole mountain. I scrolled through every single photograph in that album. There were 23 of them. I counted. Dinner at a restaurant with candles and white tablecloths, a horse-drawn sleigh ride, hot chocolate by a fireplace that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Not one photograph included me. I set the phone face down on the counter and stood there with both hands pressed against the edge of the sink, staring at the faucet, my heart beating a little too fast and a little too hard. Then I heard Tommy's voice from the living room. "Grandpa, the fort fell down again." And I pushed whatever I was feeling back down into my chest where it belonged, fixed my face into something that looked like a normal human expression, and went to rebuild the fort. That night, after the kids were asleep, I told myself a story. The story went like this: Emily was trying to keep the peace with Greg's family. The Moores were important to Greg's career, his sense of himself, his happiness. Emily was a good wife doing what good wives sometimes have to do. It wasn't personal. It wasn't a reflection of how she felt about me. It was just logistics. I told myself that story 2 more times over the next 2 years, once when they went to the Hamptons, and once when they went to the Florida Keys, and each time I got a little better at believing it. By the 3rd year, I had the whole routine down cold. Emily called, I said yes. I stocked the refrigerator with Tommy's favorite snacks and Lily's particular brand of apple juice, and I did not look at Emily's social media until after the kids went home. It was easier that way. What you don't see can't make your hands grip the edge of a sink at 11 o'clock at night. It was around this time that I got to know Carol Simmons properly. Carol had lived next door for over a decade. A widow herself, sharp-eyed and plain-spoken, in the way that certain New England women are the kind of person who would tell you directly that your gutters needed cleaning, rather than hint at it for 3 years. She had brought me a casserole after Margaret's funeral, and checked on me every week, since not with pity, but with the practical, no-nonsense concern of someone who understood grief and knew that what it required was not sympathy, but company. That 3rd Christmas, she came to the door on the 26th of December, the day after Emily picked up the kids. I opened the door, and she looked at me for a moment with those sharp eyes of hers, taking in whatever it was she saw on my face. "You look like a man who needs coffee and someone to talk to," she said. "I've got both." I laughed a real laugh, rough around the edges, the kind that surprised me a little. "Come on in, Carol." We sat at the kitchen table and she poured the coffee and she asked me straight out how I was doing. Not the polite version of the question, the real one. Honestly, I wrapped both hands around my mug, feeling the warmth work its way into my palms. I feel like I spend 4 days being someone's grandfather, and then the house empties out, and I can't figure out what I'm supposed to do with myself. Carol looked at me steadily over the rim of her cup. "Bob," she said, "you know you're allowed to want things for yourself, too. You know that, right?" I opened my mouth to say, of course, naturally, yes, and then closed it again. Because the truth was, in that moment, I wasn't entirely sure I did know that. Somewhere in the 2 years since Margaret had died, I had quietly rearranged myself around other people's schedules and other people's needs, and it had started to feel so normal that I had almost stopped noticing it was happening. "I'm fine," I said finally, which was the wrong answer, and we both knew it. Carol gave me the look that meant she wasn't going to push, but she wasn't going to forget either. "All right," she said, "but I'm right next door." I nodded and changed the subject, and we talked about other things for the rest of the afternoon. But her words stayed with me long after she went home, buzzing quietly in the back of my mind like a radio left on in another room. You're allowed to want things for yourself. The 4th December came and went. So did the 5th. And by the time I finally worked up the nerve to say something to Emily about it, I had already spent 5 years teaching myself not to. I was 61 years old before I finally asked my daughter a question I should have asked on year 2. It was early December of 2022, a Tuesday evening, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with Margaret's photograph propped against the fruit bowl the way I always kept it. The house was quiet in that particular Long Island winter way, furnace, ticking wind coming off the sound, the occasional car passing on the street outside. I had been staring at the phone for 20 minutes before I picked it up. Margaret would have asked on year one. She would have picked up the phone, dialed Emily, and said in that direct, no-nonsense voice of hers, "Sweetheart, I'd like to come on the trip this year." No apology. No lengthy preamble. Just the simple, reasonable request of a woman who understood that she was entitled to ask for things. I was not that person. But I was trying. Emily picked up on the second ring already talking. Before I could get a word in something about Charleston, South Carolina, a rental house right on the water, the Moores were absolutely thrilled. Her voice had that particular energy it always had in December, bright and fast and slightly breathless, like a person running towards something wonderful. I waited for a gap in the conversation. Then I said, "Emily, I wanted to ask you something." "Sure, Dad, what's up?" My hand tightened around the phone until my knuckles ached. "Have you ever thought about bringing me along? On one of these trips? Just once." The silence on her end lasted exactly 2 seconds. I know because I counted them standing there in my kitchen, with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth. "Dad," she said, and her voice had shifted, still warm but carefully, so the warmth of someone choosing their words with precision. "This trip is really for Greg's parents. You know how important that is for our marriage. You understand, right?" My throat tightened so fast it almost hurt. "Of course," I said. "I understand. You're so great about this stuff, Dad. Seriously, the kids are going to be so excited to see you." After I hung up, I set the phone down on the table and pressed both palms flat against the wood. My eyes burned, and I blinked hard against it, furious at myself for the weakness of it, for the fact that 61 years of living had not made me immune to feeling like a child who had asked for something and been gently, firmly told no. I looked at Margaret's photograph, her laughing face, the October sunlight catching the gray in her hair. Like she had the answer ready, I said out loud. My voice came out rougher than I expected. She already had it ready before I even asked the question. Margaret just smiled her October smile and said nothing the way photographs do. I sat there for a long time after that, long enough for the furnace to cycle off and the kitchen to get cold around me. What I kept turning over in my mind wasn't the rejection itself, it was the speed of it. 2 seconds. Emily had needed exactly 2 seconds to produce a perfectly reasonable, perfectly gentle, completely airtight explanation for why I couldn't come. Which meant she had thought about this before. Which meant she had known at some level that the question was coming eventually. Which meant the answer had always been no. After that night, I made a decision. I would never ask again. Not because I stopped wanting to, but because some answers, even when they're delivered kindly, even when they're wrapped in warmth and reasonableness, land in your chest like something cold and permanent. And asking a second time would only confirm what I was already beginning to suspect. That the door wasn't stuck. It was locked. After year 5, I stopped asking questions. I just showed up. That's what I had become, a man who arrived when called and left when no longer needed. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was being a good father, a flexible father, the kind of father who didn't make things difficult. And every December when Emily called with that bright, practiced cheerfulness in her voice, I said yes before she even finished the sentence. The years piled up the way quiet years do, not with any single dramatic moment, but with small things that accumulated in the corners of my memory like dust. The way Tommy started asking fewer questions about where his parents went for Christmas. The way Lily stopped mentioning it altogether by the time she was 6, as though the arrangement had simply become the natural order of things. Grandpa stays home, everyone else goes somewhere. Tommy was 6 the December he asked me directly, We were making pancakes on Christmas morning, 2021. Tommy, standing on the step stool beside the stove, because he had decided he was old enough to flip them himself. He had flour on his chin and absolute confidence in his abilities, both of which reminded me painfully of Margaret. "Grandpa," he said, watching the bubbles form on the surface of the batter. "How come you never come with us on the trip?" My chest tightened like someone had reached in and squeezed. "I kept my voice easy the way you do when you're 63 years old, and you've had a lot of practice at keeping your voice easy." "Someone has to hold down the fort, buddy," I said. "Make sure the house doesn't float away." Tommy looked up at me with those serious brown eyes of his. "Houses don't float, Grandpa. You'd be surprised." He considered this for a moment, decided I was probably not telling him the full truth, and flipped his pancake with tremendous concentration and moderate success. He didn't ask again that morning, but the way he glanced at me sideways while we ate quietly, carefully, the way kids look at adults when they're trying to figure out what the adult isn't saying, that look stayed with me long after breakfast was done. Lily that same year had drawn a picture at school. Her teacher sent it home in her backpack with a little note attached, "Family portrait so sweet." The drawing showed 5 stick figures in front of a house: Emily, Greg, Tommy, Lily, and off to the side, slightly apart from the others, a taller figure with gray scribbled on top of his head. Grandpa Bob, alone, standing slightly outside the frame of everyone else. I put the drawing on my refrigerator with a magnet and told myself it was because children draw what they know, which was true. That was exactly why it hurt so much. By 2023, the 6th year running, Carol had stopped inviting me to her Christmas dinner. Not out of cruelty. Out of something that felt worse than cruelty, which was acceptance. She had simply stopped expecting me to be available the way you stop expecting rain in August. She would wave to me from her driveway when Emily came to drop off or pick up the kids, and her eyes would hold something I didn't want to examine too closely. The last night of that 9th Christmas, Emily came to collect Tommy and Lily around 7 in the evening. She was tan and rested in the way that people are when they've spent a week somewhere warm while the rest of Long Island endured December. She hugged the kids, loaded their bags into the car, and then turned to me with a bright smile. "You're the best dad. We couldn't do this without you." I nodded and smiled back and said it was no trouble because that was my line, and I had it memorized. Tommy climbed into the back seat, then turned and looked at me through the car window. He raised one hand in a small wave. His face was serious, older than 9 years old, had any right to look. I raised my hand back. The car backed out of the driveway. The taillights disappeared around the corner. The porch light buzzed above my head, and the street went quiet, and I stood there in the cold for a moment longer than I needed to, my hand still half raised like I hadn't gotten the message yet, that there was no one left to wave at. Then came year 10, and everything I had quietly accepted for 9 years finally reached the place where acceptance becomes something else entirely. Looking back now, the warning signs were everywhere. I just wasn't looking for them. Because when your daughter starts asking about your savings account, you don't think conspiracy. You think concern. You think she's checking in, she's being responsible. She's doing what good daughters do when their fathers get older and live alone and forget to schedule dentist appointments. You give her the benefit of the doubt because she is your child, and you have spent 65 years believing that family at its core means something. That was the story I was telling myself in October of 2024 when Emily showed up at my front door on a Saturday afternoon. She didn't come often, maybe 4 or 5 times a year, usually around the holidays, or when she needed something specific. So when I opened the door and found her standing there with a tote bag over one shoulder, and that particular smile she wore when she wanted something, my first instinct was pleasure. My daughter was here. My daughter had driven out from Manhasset to see me. I put the kettle on, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I felt for about 20 minutes like everything was exactly as it should be. Then she set her iPad on the table between us and opened it to a real estate website. "Dad," she said in the careful, gentle tone of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say. "I've been thinking. This house is a lot to maintain on your own. Have you ever thought about downsizing?" My eyes went to the walls around me. 35 years of living pressed into every corner of this house. The scuff on the baseboard where Tommy had crashed his tricycle at age 4. The window frame I had repainted 3 times because Margaret could never decide on the right shade of white. The kitchen table we had bought at an estate sale in 1994 because Margaret said it had good bones. "This is mine and Margaret's house," I said. Emily nodded slowly the way people nod when they've anticipated your objection. "Of course, Dad. I just worry about you managing everything alone. The yard, the repairs, all of it." "I've been managing alone for 6 years," I said. "I think I've got the hang of it." She smiled and let the subject drop, and we talked about other things: Tommy's soccer league, Lily's new obsession with drawing horses, a vacation Greg was planning for the spring. When she stood to leave an hour later, she gathered her coat and her tote bag from the hook by the door and walked to her car. I watched from the porch until she backed out of the driveway and drove away. It wasn't until the next morning that I noticed she had left her iPad on the kitchen table. I set it on the shelf above the refrigerator, meaning to call her about it. But the days got away from me the way days do when you live alone and your schedule is your own, and the iPad sat up there untouched. 3 weeks later, Emily called on a Sunday evening. "Dad, I've been meaning to ask, do you have a financial advisor? Someone who helps you manage your retirement accounts?" I frowned at the phone. "I've handled my own money for 40 years, Emily." I know. Her voice was smooth, reasonable, the voice of someone who has thought carefully about how to phrase something. "It's just that things get complicated as we get older. There's no shame in having someone help." "I appreciate the concern," I said. "I'm fine." 2 weeks after that, Emily and Greg invited me for dinner at their house in Manhasset, which happened maybe twice a year, and always felt slightly formal, like a meeting that had been scheduled, rather than a meal between family members. Greg met me at the door, shook my hand with that firm, practiced grip of his, and led me into the living room. Greg Moore was the kind of man who always seemed to be thinking about something other than the conversation he was currently in. He was successful and pleasant, and there was not a single spontaneous thing about him. Over dinner, he asked about my health, my sleep, whether I was keeping up with my doctor appointments, all perfectly reasonable questions that somehow, coming from Greg, landed with the weight of an interview. Then, as I was putting on my coat to leave, he stopped me in the hallway. "Shababo," he said casually, like the thought had just occurred to him. "Have you given any thought to what happens to the house if something ever happened to you? Estate planning stuff. It's worth thinking about." My hand froze on my coat button. Something cold moved through my chest, quick and quiet like a draft from under a door. "I've thought about it," I said. Greg nodded pleasantly. "Smart man." And then he called into the kitchen to tell Emily I was leaving, and just like that, the conversation was over, folded away, as neatly as if it had never happened. I drove home with both hands tight on the steering wheel, my jaw aching from holding it set, telling myself the same story I had been telling myself for 6 years. He's just being practical. She's just being caring. That's what family does. 6 weeks later, I drove to Emily's house for Christmas with a bag full of gifts and no idea at all that I was walking into the last scene of a play I had never been given the script for. She called at 7:43 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was standing at the kitchen counter watching the coffee maker finish its cycle, and I had just looked at the clock on the microwave 7:42, thinking that it was Christmas morning, and I had nowhere to be, and no particular reason to be up this early, except that my body had spent 65 years waking before sunrise and had apparently decided it was too old to change now. Then my phone buzzed on the counter. Emily's name on the screen. I looked at it for a moment. The coffee maker beeped. Steam curled up from the carafe. I picked up the phone and pressed it to my ear. "Merry Christmas, Dad." Her voice was bright and warm, the kind of warm that costs something to maintain. "Did I wake you?" "No," I said. "I was up. Good, good." A brief pause, just long enough to be intentional. "So listen, Dad, we got everything booked for Cabo. The kids are so excited. I was wondering, could you head over around 4 this afternoon? Greg's parents are flying in, and we want to get settled before dinner." I did not answer right away. I turned toward the window above the sink. Outside, the street was empty and gray, a thin skin of frost on the parked cars, the neighbors' Christmas lights still blinking in the pre-dawn dark. I had lived on this street for 35 years. I had shoveled this sidewalk every winter, watched every oak tree on the block grow from saplings into things that shaded the whole road in summer. This was my neighborhood. This was my morning. This was my life. And standing there in my kitchen on Christmas morning, I came closer to saying no than I had in 10 years. The word was right there. 2 letters. I could feel it in my throat, solid and real, and for one long moment I honestly believed I was going to say it. I was going to say, "Emily, I don't think I can make it this year." I was going to say, "I think this Christmas I'm going to do something for myself." I was going to say the thing I should have said 5 years ago when the door first locked, and I stood on the wrong side of it, pretending I didn't notice. Then I thought about Tommy. 9 years old already, too serious for his age, already carrying around that careful, watchful expression that meant he understood more than he was supposed to. And Lily, 7 years old, who still ran to the door when she heard my car in the driveway, who grabbed my hand while we watched Christmas movies and didn't let go until she fell asleep. Those kids hadn't built this situation. They were just living inside it the same way I was. "Sure, Emily," I said. My voice came out steady. I had a lot of practice making my voice come out steady. "I'll be there at 4. You're the absolute best dad. Seriously. The kids are going to be so happy." She was already moving on, already talking about what to pack, something about Tommy's snow boots, even though they were going to Mexico, and I held the phone to my ear and made the appropriate sounds and watched the coffee finish brewing. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I picked up Margaret's photograph from the table and held it in both hands, the way I sometimes did when I needed to think clearly and couldn't manage it on my own. Her face looked back at me, steady and warm and completely unable to help. "1 more year," I told her. "Just 1 more." She kept smiling her October smile. I set the photograph back down. I showered and dressed and went to the hall closet where I had stored Tommy and Lily's gifts, wrapped carefully the week before. Labeled in my best handwriting, the paper creased at exact right angles, the way Margaret had always done it, and the way I had learned to do it from watching her for 30 years. A remote control truck for Tommy that I had spent 40 minutes researching online. A set of colored pencils and a proper sketchbook for Lily, because she was always drawing and she deserved something better than the thin school paper she'd been using. I loaded the bags into the car. The morning air was sharp and cold against my face, the kind of cold that makes your eyes water before you've had a chance to decide whether you're going to cry. I backed out of the driveway. The frost crunched under the tires. I told myself this was fine. I told myself I was doing something good for 2 kids who loved me. I told myself the hollow feeling sitting in the center of my chest was just the cold, just the early hour, just the particular loneliness of Christmas morning when you live alone and your wife has been gone for 6 years. I told myself a lot of things on that drive. None of them were true. I pulled into Emily's driveway at 4 in the afternoon and immediately knew something was different. The yard was full of cars. Not just Frank and Patricia Moore's silver Lexus, which I recognized from the 2 or 3 times I had seen it over the years, but 4 other vehicles I didn't recognize at all: a black SUV with Connecticut plates, a newer model sedan, a minivan with a dent in the rear bumper. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, engine still running, looking at all those cars lined up along the curb and in the driveway like a statement of some kind. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe Greg had invited some colleagues. Maybe the Moores had brought friends. People did that at Christmas, expanded the circle, added chairs, made room. That was what the holidays were supposed to be about. I turned off the engine and picked up the gift bags from the back seat. They were heavier than I remembered, or maybe my arms were just tired. I walked up the front path, the bags bumping against my legs, the cold air working its way through my jacket in that particular way it has in December on Long Island, finding every gap and seam and making itself at home. I was about 10 feet from the front door when I heard the voices. The window to the right of the door was open a crack, just an inch, maybe less, the kind of gap you leave when a kitchen gets warm from cooking. The voices came through it clearly enough. Greg's voice first, low, certain, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. "You sure he's not staying, right?" My feet stopped moving. Every muscle in my body went rigid at once, the gift bags swinging to a stop against my legs. The cold air kept moving, but I had stopped feeling it. I stood absolutely still on that front path, 10 feet from my daughter's front door, and waited. Emily's voice came through the gap a second later. Lighter than Greg's. Matter of fact. "No. He's just here to watch the kids. He'll leave when we're done." The words hit me in the sternum like something physical. I actually took a small step backward, just one, before I caught myself. My throat closed up so fast it made my ears ring, and for a moment the whole front yard tilted slightly, the way things do when your body receives information that your brain hasn't finished processing yet. "He's just here to watch the kids. He'll leave when we're done." I stood on that path for what felt like a very long time. Long enough for the cold to find its way all the way through my jacket and settle against my skin. I told myself I had misheard. I told myself there was an innocent explanation, a context I was missing. Some piece of the conversation that had come before that would make those words land differently. I had spent 10 years finding innocent explanations for things that didn't have them, and I was very good at it, but my hands had started shaking. The gift bags rattled softly in my grip, and somewhere underneath all that practiced explaining, in the place where the truth lives before you're ready to let it out, I already knew. I made myself walk to the store. I made myself raise my fist and knock 3 times. I made myself put something on my face that resembled a normal human expression. 65 years of getting through things had given me at least that much. The door opened. Emily stood in the frame, dressed for a dinner party, her hair done, a glass of red wine in her hand. When she saw me, something quick and unreadable moved across her face. Surprise, maybe, or something adjacent to it. "Oh, Dad." She stepped back to let me in, her voice warm and practiced. "You made it." The way she said it. "You made it." Like I was a guest who had shown up unexpectedly, rather than a man who had been asked to come. I stepped inside. The house was full of voices and warmth and the smell of something expensive cooking. From the hallway I could see straight through to the dining room, and what I saw there made something in my chest go very quiet and very cold at the same time. The table was set for a dinner party. White tablecloth, good china candles burning low, and at every place a small card with a name written on it in Emily's careful handwriting. I could read most of them from where I stood. Greg, Emily, Frank, Patricia. Names I didn't recognize, the Connecticut plates, probably friends of the Moores. And at the far end, two smaller cards, side by side. Tommy, Lily. I stood in my daughter's hallway with 2 bags of Christmas gifts in my shaking hands, and looked at that table for a long moment, reading every card I could see, counting every chair. And then, because I had to be sure, because I needed to know with absolute certainty before I let myself believe it, I walked slowly into the dining room and looked at every single place setting. Every one. My name was not there. Before I tell you what happened when I walked through that door on Christmas night, I need to know if you're still with me. Drop the number 9 in the comments right now, one number, that's all, so I know you're here. Because what I'm about to share changed everything, and I don't want you to miss it. Quick note: this story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and reflection. It may not reflect every detail of lived experience, and if this type of content isn't for you, it's completely okay to step away now. I stood in that dining room for what felt like a full minute, though it was probably closer to 10 seconds. 10 seconds of looking at a table set for everyone in my daughter's life except me. 10 seconds of reading place cards in Emily's careful handwriting, of counting chairs, of understanding with the particular clarity that only arrives when you have finally run out of ways to misunderstand something. The candles on the table burned low and steady. The good china caught the light. Everything was exactly as it should be for a Christmas dinner, except that the man who had spent 10 years showing up for this family had not been given a place at it. I turned toward Emily. She was standing near the doorway to the kitchen, her wine glass in her hand, watching me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not quite guilt, not quite defiance, something uncomfortably close to impatience, like a person waiting for a scene they'd been dreading to finally begin so it could be over. "Where do I sit, Emily?" I asked. My voice came out quieter than I expected. Steady. I had not planned for it to be steady, but there it was. The room shifted. Conversation nearby dropped away. Frank Moore, who had been saying something to a man I didn't recognize, stopped mid-sentence. Greg set down his drink on the sideboard with a small, careful click. Tommy, sitting at the far end of the table, already looked up from whatever he had been doing and found my face across the room with those serious brown eyes of his. Lily beside him reached over and gripped her brother's sleeve with both hands. Emily looked at me. Then she looked away. "Dad," she said, and her voice had the particular softness of someone delivering news they have rehearsed. "Tonight is really for Greg's family. You understand?" It was not a question. The air went out of my lungs slowly, like a tire with a small leak. Not a blowout, not dramatic, just a gradual and complete deflation. I had imagined on some level that hearing it said out loud would feel different from knowing it. I had thought that perhaps the words themselves would make it real in a way that would finally produce the anger I deserved, to feel the righteous and clarifying fury that would straighten my spine and give me something to push against. Instead, I just felt tired, 65 years old, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Patricia Moore stepped forward from where she had been standing near the window. She was a trim, well-dressed woman in her late 60s, the kind of woman who had opinions about table settings and expressed them. She looked at me with the brisk, slightly pitying expression of someone dealing with a situation they find mildly inconvenient. "Salma, don't be so sensitive, Robert," she said. "Older people need to understand that their children have their own lives to manage." Something hot moved through my chest at that not quite anger, but the temperature of it. My jaw tightened hard enough to ache. I looked at Patricia Moore and I thought about 10 Decembers. I thought about 10 Christmas trees decorated in someone else's living room. I thought about Tommy's blanket fort and Lily's first clap, and all those bedtime stories read to children who called out for me in the dark and found me there every single time because I had never once not shown up. I thought about all of that. And then I looked at Tommy. He was sitting at the end of the table with his hands flat on the tablecloth, his small face tight with something that looked on a 9-year-old remarkably like shame. Not his own shame, but the particular painful kind you feel when the adults around you are doing something wrong and you are too young to stop them. His eyes found mine and held them, and what I saw there broke something open in my chest in a way that Patricia Moore's words had not managed to do. I looked down at the gift bags in my hands. Tommy's remote control truck, Lily's sketchbook and colored pencils. Very carefully, very deliberately, I walked to the end of the table and set both bags down beside Tommy's chair. Not because I wanted to make a statement, not because I wanted anyone to feel the weight of what I was doing, but because those gifts were for 2 children who had nothing to do with any of this, and they were going to have them regardless of what their grandfather did next. "Merry Christmas, buddy," I said quietly to Tommy. His chin wobbled. He pressed his lips together hard, the way kids do when they're fighting something they don't want to show. "Grandpa," he started. "It's okay," I said, and I meant it. Not the way I usually meant things when I said they were okay, not as a performance, not as a way to make the moment easier for everyone else. I meant it because I had just made a decision standing in that dining room with its candles and its perfect table, and its complete absence of a place for me, and the decision had made everything suddenly strangely clear. I straightened up. I looked at Emily one more time. She was staring at a point somewhere to the left of my face, her wine glass held against her chest, like a shield. I walked to the front door. I took my coat from the hook. I let myself out. Nobody called after me. I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes. I watched the numbers on the dashboard clock change 1 minute at a time, while the lights in Emily's dining room glowed warm and gold through the window. My hands rested on my thighs, and I noticed with some distant part of my brain that they had finally stopped shaking. Then I drove home. And that night, completely by accident, I found out what my daughter had really been planning. Before I tell you what I found that night when I got home, comment the word truth below. Because what I'm about to reveal is something I never expected to find. Something that reordered everything I thought I knew about my own daughter. Are you ready? Because once you hear this, you cannot unhear it. And a quick reminder, this story includes some fictional elements crafted for reflection and meaningful storytelling. Names, places, and certain details are not intended to represent anyone specifically, but the message inside is one worth sitting with. I got home at 5:30 and stood in the kitchen without turning on the lights. The refrigerator hummed. The furnace ticked. Outside, somewhere down the street, a neighbor's dog was barking at something that probably wasn't there. Normal sounds from a normal house on a normal Christmas evening, except that nothing about the last hour had been normal, and my body hadn't caught up to that fact yet. My coat was still on. I hadn't moved since I closed the back door behind me. I made a sandwich I didn't eat. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at it for a while. Then I got up, put the sandwich in the refrigerator, and stood in the middle of the kitchen trying to figure out what a person was supposed to do with themselves on Christmas night, when everything they had believed about their family had just been quietly, efficiently dismantled in a dining room in Manhasset. That was when I remembered the iPad. Emily had left it on my kitchen shelf 2 months ago, and I had been meaning to return it ever since. And somehow the days had kept passing without me doing it. I reached up and took it down from the shelf. My first thought was Tommy and Lily. I wanted to find a photograph of them. Something recent, something to hold on to after the evening I had just had. I unlocked the screen. Emily had never changed the passcode from the one she'd set when she borrowed my Wi-Fi years ago. The same 4 digits I had watched her type a dozen times. The iPad opened to her email. She had left her Gmail account logged in. The inbox was full of things that weren't my business work, emails, newsletters, a thread about holiday plans, and I was about to navigate away to the Photos app when my eyes caught the folder on the left side of the screen. Drafts. One unread. I don't know why I clicked on it. Some instinct, maybe. Some part of me that had been paying closer attention than the rest of me all these months, quietly adding things up, the questions about the house, the retirement accounts, Greg's careful inquiry about estate planning in the hallway, and had finally decided it was time to see the full picture. The draft email had no subject line. The recipient was listed as Hargrove and Associates Elder Law Division, with an address in Garden City, New York. I knew Garden City. It was 20 minutes from my house. I read the email. Then I read it again. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs had stopped working properly, and the chair was too far away. The email was from Emily. It was addressed to a law firm that specialized in what New York State calls Article 81 guardianship proceedings, a legal process by which a court can appoint someone to manage the personal and financial affairs of a person who has been determined to lack the capacity to manage those affairs themselves. The person in the language of the law is called an incapacitated person. The person applying for guardianship is called the petitioner. Emily was writing to ask about becoming my petitioner. The email described me in language that made my stomach turn over. It said I had been showing signs of cognitive decline. It said I had become forgetful, socially withdrawn, prone to poor financial decisions. It said my family was concerned about my ability to manage my own affairs. It used the word vulnerable 3 times. It described me as a man slipping away from himself, a man who needed someone to step in before things got worse. And then, in the final paragraph, written as though it were an afterthought, as though it were simply a practical matter to be addressed, alongside everything else it mentioned the house. The family residence Emily had written, Nassau County, currently in my father's name, valued at approximately $890,000. I sat on that kitchen floor for a long time. The refrigerator kept humming. The furnace kept ticking. The neighbor's dog had stopped barking. Outside, Long Island was doing whatever Long Island does on Christmas night: families finishing dinner, kids playing with new toys, people calling relatives they only spoke to twice a year. All of it completely ordinary. All of it completely untouched by what was happening on my kitchen floor. I thought about the questions Emily had asked me over the past 2 months. Do you still need this big house? Do you have someone managing your retirement accounts? Have you thought about what happens if something happened to you? I had heard concern in those questions. I had heard a daughter paying attention, checking in, doing what good daughters did. I had heard the wrong thing entirely. She had not been asking because she was worried about me. She had been building a case. Every question was a brick. Every conversation was a foundation. And the house I had lived in for 35 years, the house where Margaret and I had raised our daughter and painted the window frames and bought the kitchen table at an estate sale. Because it had good bones, that house was what they had been building toward all along. My hands had started shaking again. Not the way they had shaken in Emily's hallway from shock and hurt and the effort of keeping my face arranged into something acceptable. This was different. This was something colder and more focused, moving through me like current through a wire. I pulled myself up from the floor, using the counter for support. I closed the email without touching anything else on the iPad. I set it back on the shelf above the refrigerator, exactly where it had been. Then my phone lit up on the kitchen table, a text message from a number I knew by heart. Tommy. Tommy's text came in at 8:47 that night. I was still in the kitchen, still standing at the counter with the iPad back on its shelf, and the uneaten sandwich still in the refrigerator, and my whole understanding of my own family rearranged into something I hadn't finished looking at yet. When my phone lit up, I grabbed it so fast I nearly knocked it off the table. 9 words. Grandpa, did you get home safe? I'm sorry about tonight. I stood there with my phone in both hands and read those 9 words 4 times. My throat tightened so fast it hurt. 9 years old. This child was 9 years old, and he had waited until he thought enough time had passed for me to be home, and then he had picked up his phone and typed out an apology for something that was not remotely his fault, because he was a good kid in a situation that good kids shouldn't have to navigate. I typed back carefully 1 letter at a time because my hands were not entirely steady. I'm home safe, buddy. Merry Christmas. Don't worry about tonight, that's not on you, he replied within 30 seconds. I know. But it wasn't right. I pressed my lips together hard. I wanted to call him. I wanted to hear his voice, that careful, serious voice of his that always sounded like it belonged to someone 10 years older. But it was almost 9 o'clock on Christmas night, and he was 9 years old, and his parents were in the next room, and some conversations are too large to have across a phone line between a grandfather and a child who shouldn't have to carry them. You're a good kid, Tommy, I typed. Get some sleep. I love you. Love you too, Grandpa. A pause. Then I saved you a piece of pie, but Mom said you didn't want any. Something cracked open in my chest at that, quick and clean like a fault line giving way. I put the phone face down on the table and pressed both hands over my eyes, and stood there breathing carefully until the feeling passed enough to be manageable. Mom said you didn't want any. I hadn't been offered any pie. I hadn't been offered a seat at the table. I hadn't been offered so much as a glass of water. But Emily had told her 9-year-old son that Grandpa didn't want any had constructed even for a child, even in that small domestic detail, a version of events in which I was absent by choice. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around me. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, I finally accepted that sleep was not going to come, and got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table until the sky outside the window started going gray. The mail came at 10:15 the next morning. I heard the truck from the kitchen, the familiar rumble and stop, and I went to the front door in my socks because I had been indoors since Christmas night. And going to the mailbox felt in some way I couldn't entirely explain, like a thing I needed to do. Something normal. Something that belonged to the regular world, the world where people got mail and drank coffee and didn't sit on kitchen floors, reading emails that reordered everything they knew. There were 3 pieces of mail. A utility bill. A furniture catalog I had never subscribed to. And a small envelope slightly crumpled at the corner, addressed in the large and careful handwriting of a child who had recently learned that letters had to be neat to be read. Mr. Bob Callahan. My name written with tremendous seriousness, each letter distinct. The return address was Tommy's house in Manhasset. Something in my hands went unsteady again, but this time it was different. The warm kind of trembling that comes from something that hurts in a completely different direction than the cold trembling of the night before. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope very carefully, the way you open something you already know is going to cost you something. Inside were 2 pieces of paper. The first was a letter written in pencil on lined notebook paper, in the handwriting of a 7-year-old, the large, uneven, enormously earnest handwriting of a child who is trying very hard. Dear Grandpa, I saved you a piece of pie. Mom threw it away, but I think that was mean. I put your name on a chair with a crayon, but they moved it. I wanted you to sit with us. I love you. Lily. I read it twice. My eyes were burning so badly, I had to set the paper down and press the back of my hand against them hard until the burning subsided enough to keep going. The second piece of paper was a drawing. Lily had done it in colored pencil, the good colored pencils I had given her the Christmas before the ones she kept in the blue tin case on her desk. The drawing showed a house with warm yellow light pouring from its windows. Inside the house, around a table, were several figures, small and round-headed, the way children draw people sitting together in the light. And outside the house, standing in what Lily had colored a careful and deliberate blue-gray, to indicate cold, standing alone on the outside of the window. Looking in was one more figure, taller than the others. Gray scribbled on top of his head, Grandpa Bob, on the outside. Looking in at everyone else, I sat at that kitchen table and I wept. Not the careful, controlled kind of almost crying I had been doing for 10 years, pressing things back down into my chest and keeping my face arranged and getting on with it. Real crying, the kind that starts in your sternum and moves upward and takes over your face completely, the kind Margaret used to hold me through on the rare occasions it happened, and I had not done since the day we buried her. I cried for a long time. Then I folded Lily's letter and her drawing very carefully and put them in my wallet right next to Margaret's photograph, and I wiped my face with a dish towel and stood up straight. I had some things to figure out. St. Agnes Catholic Church was 12 minutes from my house, and I had driven those 12 minutes so many times over so many years that my hands knew the route, without asking my brain for directions. I had not been there since Margaret's funeral. That was 6 years ago, and I had told myself at the time that I would go back when I was ready, and the months had kept passing, and the readiness had never quite arrived, and eventually I had stopped waiting for it. But that morning, still in the same clothes I had worn to Emily's house the night before, my wallet, heavier than usual with Lily's drawing folded inside it, I got in the car and drove those 12 minutes without thinking about it too carefully. Sometimes your body knows where it needs to go before your mind has finished arguing about it. The church was nearly empty at that hour on the day after Christmas, just a handful of people scattered through the pews. The particular quiet of a sacred space on an ordinary morning, the smell of candle wax and old wood that had been the same since I was a boy. I took a pew near the middle, not too close to the altar, not too far back. I sat down. I did not know exactly what I was going to do there. I just knew I needed to be somewhere that wasn't my kitchen. I heard Father Brennan before I saw him, the soft sound of his shoes on the stone floor, the quiet movement of someone who had spent 50 years learning how to exist without disturbing things. He was a tall man, Father Brennan, white-haired and unhurried, with the kind of face that had been lived in long enough to be interesting. He had married me and Margaret in this church 38 years ago. He had buried her 6 years ago. He knew me in the particular way that priests know the people who have brought them the most important moments of their lives. He came down the side aisle and stopped at my pew. He looked at me for a moment, took in whatever it was. He saw the clothes from the night before, the red around my eyes, the set of my jaw, and then he sat down beside me without saying a word. We sat like that for a few minutes. The candles on the altar burned. Somewhere near the back of the church, an elderly woman was murmuring a rosary, the words soft and rhythmic as running water. Then Father Brennan said, "You look like a man who had a hard Christmas, Robert. Something about hearing my name in that voice in that building on that morning. Something about all of it at once made my throat close up so fast that for a moment I couldn't speak at all. I pressed my lips together and breathed through my nose and waited until I trusted my voice again. You could say that, Father," I managed. "Tell me," he said. Not a question. just an invitation, open and unhurried the way he had always done things. So I told him. I started at the beginning, not the very beginning, not 10 years back, but the beginning that mattered, the part that had brought me to this pew on this morning. I told him about the dining room table and the place cards and the question nobody answered. I told him about coming home and finding the iPad and sitting on the kitchen floor reading an email that described me as a man slipping away from himself. I told him about Tommy's text message and Lily's drawing about the figure standing outside in the cold, looking in at everyone else through a lit window. My voice cracked twice. I did not apologize for it. Father Brennan listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone choosing carefully among many things. "Robert," he said finally, "in 50 years of sitting with people in pain, do you know what I've noticed?" I shook my head. The people who stay where they're not wanted, they don't do it because they're strong. He turned to look at me directly, his pale eyes steady and clear. They do it because somewhere along the way they forgot they had a choice. My chest ached at that. "She's my daughter, Father." "She is," he said. "And you are her father. Those are both true things." He paused. "But God sets a place for everyone at his table, Robert. Anyone who doesn't isn't worth staying for." I looked at the altar, at the candles burning in the dim morning light, at the cross above the tabernacle that I had looked at on the day I married Margaret, and the day I buried her, and at every point in between when I needed something solid to look at. "Margaret used to say I disappeared into the background," I said. My voice came out rough and low. "She made me promise I wouldn't." Father Brennan put his hand on my shoulder. It was a brief gesture, firm and warm, the kind that doesn't ask anything from you and doesn't need anything back. "Margaret would not have stayed," he said quietly. "You know that." The words hit me somewhere deep and true, the way the right words do when you have been circling a thing for a long time without being able to name it. My eyes burned fiercely, and I blinked hard against it, pressing my back teeth together, breathing carefully through the tightness in my chest. Because he was right. I knew he was right. Margaret, with her direct eyes and her October laugh and her absolute conviction that she was entitled to take up space in any room she walked into. Margaret would not have spent 10 years in the background of someone else's Christmas. She would have asked on year 1. She would have said her piece on year 2. By year 3, she would have made other plans entirely, and she would have done it without guilt and without apology, because she had always understood something that had taken me 65 years and one email on a kitchen floor to begin to grasp, that love, real love, does not ask you to disappear. I stood up. My knees ached from the cold of the pew and the weight of the night before, but I stood up straight, and I looked at Father Brennan, and I said, "Thank you, Father." He nodded once. "Go figure out your next step, Robert. Then come back and tell me how it went." I walked out of St. Agnes into the gray December morning and stood on the front steps for a moment, breathing the cold air into my lungs. My hands were steady. My jaw had stopped aching. I drove home and called a number I hadn't dialed in almost 2 years. Dennis picked up on the second ring. "Bobby." His voice was the same as it always was, low and unhurried, slightly rough around the edges, the way voices get when a man has spent 68 years in Western New York and never lost the habit of talking like he had somewhere better to be. "It's been a while." "It has," I said. "I'm sorry about that. Don't apologize. You calling now is what matters." A pause, the sound of him settling into something, a chair. Probably Dennis was always settling into chairs. "What's going on?" I had planned on the drive home from St. Agnes to be concise, to give him the facts in orderly, without editorializing. Dennis was not a man who needed things dressed up. He was 3 years older than me, a retired electrician, like I was twice divorced, living alone in a house in Buffalo that he kept immaculate, because he had run out of other ways to feel in control of his life. We had grown up sharing a bedroom on the North Shore of Long Island, and we had spent most of our adult lives being the kind of brothers who meant to call more often than they did. He had told me the day after Margaret's funeral, standing in the parking lot of this same church I had just left, that I should call him if I needed anything. I had nodded and thanked him and driven home alone, and then nearly 2 years had passed, and I had not called. I told him everything. It took longer than I expected, because once I started, I found I couldn't be as concise as I had planned. The 10 Decembers came out in a rush, not the individual details, but the shape of them, the accumulated weight of a decade of arriving when called and leaving when dismissed. Then the dining room table, the place cards, the question nobody answered. Coming home to find the iPad and sitting on the kitchen floor with my legs stopped working. Reading an email that described me as a man slipping away from himself while the real agenda sat in the last paragraph like a stone at the bottom of a clear pool. Dennis did not interrupt. He did not make sympathetic sounds or offer commentary. He just listened the way men of a certain generation listen quietly, completely, with the particular focused attention of someone who understands that the most useful thing he can do right now is hear the whole thing before he says a word. When I finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Then Dennis said, "Bobby, Margaret would be heartbroken if she saw this." My throat tightened immediately, hard and fast. "I know," I said. "Not at you," he added. "At Emily." Margaret would be absolutely furious at Emily. I let out a breath that was almost a laugh, the kind of almost laugh that lives right next to something much heavier. "Yeah," I said. "She would." "She'd have handled this on year 2, Dennis said. "Year 1, probably." Father Brennan said the same thing more or less. Father Brennan always was a smart man. Another pause. I could hear Dennis breathing the slow, deliberate breath of someone thinking something through. "What are you going to do?" "I have some idea," I said. "I need to talk to a lawyer first. Someone who handles elder law. There's a firm in Garden City I want to contact." "Good." His voice was firm, immediate. No hesitation, no second-guessing, no long discussion about whether I was sure. Just good. That was Dennis. He decided quickly, and he committed completely, and he did not waste time on doubt once the decision was made. It was the quality I had always admired most in him and replicated least in myself. "I might need you," I said. It cost me something to say it. I had spent 6 years not needing anyone, or at least performing not needing anyone well enough to convince myself. "Tell me when," Dennis said. "I'll drive down." "It's a 6-hour drive." "Bobby." His voice had that particular edge it got when he thought I was being unnecessarily complicated about something simple. "I know how far Long Island is. I've been driving there my whole life. You tell me when you need me and I'll be there. That's it. That's the whole conversation." My chest ached with something that was not quite pain. "Okay," I said. "Thank you, Dennis." "Stop thanking me and get some sleep. You sound like you haven't slept in 2 days." "1 day," I said. "Same thing at our age." He paused. "Bobby, you did the right thing leaving that house last night. I want you to know that." I pressed the back of my hand against my eyes for a moment, hard enough to see sparks. "I just put the gifts down and walked out," I said. "It didn't feel like doing the right thing. It just felt like the only thing left to do." "Most of the right things do," Dennis said. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold without me noticing. Margaret's photograph was in front of me, propped against the fruit bowl in its usual spot. I looked at her face. That laughing October face, the sunlight in her gray hair, the absolute ease of a woman who had always known exactly where she belonged. Dennis arrived 2 days later on the 27th, driving straight through from Buffalo in his old Ford pickup, showing up at my door at 4 in the afternoon with a six-pack of beer and absolutely nothing in the way of a speech prepared. He just walked in, set the beer on the kitchen counter, looked around the house with the assessing eye of a man who had grown up in it, and said, "You look terrible." "Thank you, Dennis," I said. I mean it in the best possible way." He pulled out 2 bottles, opened them on the edge of the counter, the way we had both been doing since we were teenagers, and handed one to me. "Now sit down and tell me what the lawyer said." I pulled out a chair, and for the first time since Christmas night, I felt something in my chest loosen just slightly, the particular relief of having another person in the room who was entirely unconditionally on your side. Carol knocked on my door at 9:15 the next morning. Dennis had slept in the guest room and was still upstairs when I heard the knock, 3 sharp raps. Carol's knock, the same one she had used for 15 years. The kind of knock that means I'm not going anywhere until you answer. I opened the door and found her standing on the porch with a brown paper bag in one hand and a thermos in the other, wearing the red wool coat she put on every December and didn't take off until March. She looked at my face for a long moment. Whatever she saw there made something in her own expression shift, a tightening around the eyes, a compression of the lips, the look of a woman who has been carrying something heavy and has finally decided she cannot carry it one more step. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. The thermos trembled slightly against her fingers, just enough for me to notice. "Can I come in?" I stepped back and let her through. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared coffee 100 times over 15 years, and Carol set the bag and the thermos between us and folded her hands on the tabletop. Her knuckles were white. Whatever she was holding on to, she was holding tight. "Before you say anything," she started, "I want you to know that I am sorry. I am genuinely deeply sorry, and I understand completely if you're angry with me when I'm done." My chest tightened. "Carol, let me finish." Her voice cracked on the second word just slightly, and she pressed her lips together and breathed through it. 8 weeks ago, the first week of November, Emily came to see me. The kitchen went very still around me. I could hear Dennis moving upstairs, the old floorboards creaking under his weight, but down here everything was perfectly, precisely still. She came to the door on a Tuesday afternoon. Carol continued. "She said she was worried about you. She said you'd been seeming forgetful lately, confused sometimes, not quite yourself. She said she was concerned about your ability to manage on your own." Carol's jaw tightened. She was very smooth about it, Bob. Very calm, very reasonable, the way she gets when she has prepared what she wants to say. My hands gripped the edge of the table so hard the wood bit into my palms. "What did she ask you?" Carol looked at me directly. Her eyes were bright with something that was equal parts guilt and fury. "She asked me if I would be willing to speak to your current mental state. Formally, if it ever came to that. If anyone ever needed to know, a doctor, a lawyer, a judge, whether I had observed signs that you were struggling." The word judge landed in my chest, like something dropped from a height. "She wanted you to testify that I was losing my mind," I said. My voice came out flat and very quiet. "She wanted me to confirm it," Carol said. She was careful not to use words like testify, but that was what she meant. Carol's hands unfolded and refolded on the table, a small, restless movement she couldn't seem to stop. I looked her in the eye. Bob and I told her no. I told her you were the sharpest man on this street, and she knew it. I told her that if she brought something like that to me again, I would tell you about it myself. But you didn't, I said. Carol flinched. It was a small movement, barely visible, but I had known this woman for 15 years, and I saw it. No, she said. I didn't. Her voice dropped. I told myself I had misread it. I told myself maybe she was just being an overprotective daughter who didn't know how to express concern properly. I told myself that if I said something, it might damage things between you two that couldn't be repaired, and I didn't want to be the one responsible for that. She looked up at me, and her eyes were wet now, bright with tears she was refusing to let fall. I was wrong, Bob. I should have told you the same day she left. That was the right thing to do, and I didn't do it. And I'm sorry. The silence stretched between us. Upstairs, Dennis had stopped moving. The furnace kicked on with its familiar tick and rumble. I looked at Carol. This woman who had brought me casseroles when Margaret died, who had checked on me every week for 6 years, who had said no to my daughter when it would have been so much easier to say something vague and non-committal and let it go. Who was sitting at my kitchen table right now with white knuckles and wet eyes telling me the truth she should have told me 8 weeks ago. Did you actually say you would tell me? I asked. I did, she said. I told her flat out. She left without responding to that part. I breathed in slowly, then out. My palms were aching from the table edge, and I released my grip and set my hands flat. Carol, I said, you said no. When it mattered, when she actually asked you to do something, you said no. Carol blinked hard. One tear escaped, and she caught it with the back of her hand, quick and impatient, like she was annoyed at herself for it. I should have done more than say no. You should have, I agreed. But you said no. That matters. She pressed both hands over her mouth for a moment, her shoulders tight with the effort of holding herself together. Then she lowered them and looked at me with those wet, honest eyes. Are you angry with me? I thought about it genuinely the way she deserved. No, I said finally. I'm not angry with you. You should be. Probably, I said. But I'm not. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers for a moment, just long enough to mean something. You're here now. You're telling me the truth now. That's what I've got, and I'm choosing to work with it. Carol let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, a long and shuddering exhale, like a person setting down something they had been carrying since the first week of November. Just then, Dennis appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair uncombed, holding one of my coffee mugs. He looked at Carol. He looked at me. He read the room with the efficiency of a man who had learned through 2 marriages and 68 years of living to understand what a conversation looked like when it had just finished costing someone something. I'm going to need a bigger mug, he said. Carol let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob and covered her mouth again, and I found myself doing something I had not expected to do that morning. In that kitchen, I laughed too. A real one. Short and rough and entirely genuine. Sit down, Dennis, I said. There's more coffee. He sat. And for the next hour, the 3 of us sat around that kitchen table while Carol told Dennis everything she had just told me, and Dennis listened with his arms crossed and his jaw getting tighter and tighter until he finally said in the low, careful voice of a man keeping something considerably larger in check, "Well, she's not going to get away with it." "No," I said. "She's not." The next morning, I called Marcus Webb's office in Garden City and made an appointment. Marcus Webb's office was on the third floor of a building on Franklin Avenue in Garden City, 20 minutes from my house by way of roads I had driven my whole life. The waiting room was plain and unhurried, a few chairs, some degrees on the wall, a receptionist who offered me water before I had even finished telling her my name. It felt like exactly the kind of place where things got handled properly, which was what I needed on the 30th of December, 5 days after Christmas, with the new year 4 days away, and my daughter's unfinished legal strategy sitting on a shelf in my kitchen in the form of a forgotten iPad. Marcus Webb was younger than I expected. 45 maybe, with a direct handshake and the manner of a man who had heard a great many difficult things and had learned to receive them without flinching. He read the printed copy of Emily's draft email that I had brought with me. I had printed it that morning at the library on Hempstead Avenue, 3 copies because I was not going to walk into a lawyer's office with only one, and he read it the way lawyers read things, carefully and completely, without any visible reaction. Then he set it on the desk between us and said, "How long ago did you find this?" 5 days, I said. He nodded. "Have they filed anything with the court?" "Not as far as I know." "Good." He leaned back slightly. "Mr. Callahan, what your daughter is describing in this email is an Article 81 guardianship proceeding under New York mental hygiene law. It's a process by which a petitioner, in this case your daughter, asks the court to declare you an incapacitated person and appoint a guardian to manage your affairs. The court takes these petitions seriously, but they also require substantial evidence. Medical evaluations, witness testimony, documented patterns of incapacity." He paused. "They haven't filed yet. That means we have time." Time to do what?" I asked. "Time to make sure that even if they file, there is nothing for them to get." He opened a folder on his desk. "First thing we do is protect the house. We transfer it into an irrevocable trust, a legal arrangement, where you move the property out of your personal ownership and into a trust that is managed according to terms you set today. Once it's in the trust, it cannot be reached by a guardianship petition because it is no longer legally yours to be managed. It belongs to the trust." I leaned forward. "And who manages the trust?" "You name a successor trustee, someone you designate to manage the trust assets if you become unable to do so. Not your daughter. Someone you genuinely trust." He looked at me. "Do you have someone like that?" "My neighbor," I said. "Carol Simmons. She's been beside me for 15 years. Marcus wrote the name down. "Good. Second, we do a formal competency evaluation today or as soon as possible. A licensed neuropsychologist documents your current cognitive status independently. This creates a contemporaneous showing that at the time you signed these documents, you were entirely capable of making your own decisions. If Emily and her husband challenge the trust, later that evaluation is what protects it." "And the power of attorney?" I asked. "Can I change that?" "Absolutely. We draw up a new durable power of attorney designating whoever you choose to manage your financial and medical decisions if you're ever genuinely unable to." He looked at his notepad. "You mentioned a brother." "Dennis," I said. "Dennis Callahan. He's in Buffalo." "He's who I'd recommend," Marcus said. "Someone outside the immediate household, no financial interest in your estate, no reason to act in anything other than your best interest." He slid 3 documents across the desk toward me. I looked at them. The trust agreement, the power of attorney form the referral for the neuropsychological evaluation. My name was at the top of each one, printed and waiting. My hands were completely steady when I picked up the pen. I had spent 10 years saying yes to things I should have said no to. Signing my name to these 3 pieces of paper was the first yes in a very long time that felt entirely unconditionally like my own. Marcus collected the signed documents and squared them against the desk. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "the good news is they haven't filed anything yet." He looked at me over the desk with the calm, direct expression of a man who meant exactly what he said. "The better news is that after today, it won't matter if they do." I stood up and shook his hand. Outside on Franklin Avenue, the December air was sharp and cold against my face. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with my hands in my coat pockets, looking up at the strip of gray winter sky above the rooftops of Garden City. 3 days into the new year, my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't immediately recognize. Patricia Moore. She asked if I would be willing to speak with her. She said she owed me an explanation. I almost didn't respond to Patricia Moore's text. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time on the 3rd of January reading her message and trying to determine what exactly I owed this woman. The woman who had stood in her daughter-in-law's dining room on Christmas night and told me not to be so sensitive, that older people needed to understand their children had their own lives. I read the message 3 times. She said she owed me an explanation. She said she had spoken with Frank. She said there were things she needed to tell me, and she would understand completely if I didn't want to hear them. I typed back, "You can call me tomorrow afternoon." She called at 2 o'clock exactly, the kind of punctuality that suggested she had been watching the clock. "Robert." Her voice was different from Christmas night, stripped of the social smoothness, the hostess register she had been running on in that dining room. What was underneath it was quieter and considerably less certain. "Thank you for taking my call." "You said you had something to tell me," I said. "I'm listening." She took a breath. "Frank and I have been talking since Christmas, about that evening, about the way things were handled, about some things Emily told us over the years, that we are now understanding in a different light." Another breath shorter. "Robert, I owe you an apology first. What I said to you in that dining room about being sensitive, about older people understanding their place, that was unkind, and it was wrong. And I have been ashamed of it since the moment you walked out the door." My jaw loosened slightly. Of all the things I had expected Patricia Moore to say, I had not entirely expected that. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "I'm not finished." Her voice steadied the way voices do when a person has decided to get through something difficult, regardless of what it costs them. "Emily told us, Robert. For years, every Christmas, every year we came to visit, every time Frank or I asked about you. Emily told us that you preferred to spend the holidays alone. She said you were a private person, that you didn't enjoy large gatherings, that you had told her yourself you were happiest staying home with the grandchildren while the rest of us traveled. She made it sound like your preference, like something you had chosen freely and were content with." The kitchen felt very still around me. I pressed my back teeth together and breathed through my nose and waited. "Frank asked me once, maybe year 3 or 4, whether we should invite you on the trip ourselves." Patricia continued. "I told him Emily had already discussed it with you, and you preferred the arrangement. Because that's what Emily had told me." Her voice cracked just slightly, the fracture line of a woman who was not accustomed to being made a fool of and was still raw from the discovery of it. "If I had known the truth, Robert, if Frank and I had known for one single year that you were being left behind, rather than choosing to stay, we would have insisted. We would have insisted from the very beginning." Something shifted in my chest. Not the cold shifting of shock. I had used up most of my shock capacity in the past 10 days. But something slower and stranger, the particular vertigo of understanding that a story you thought you knew has been running on a completely different track the entire time. Emily had not just excluded me from the table. She had written me out of the story on both ends. She had told me the Moores needed their space. She had told the Moores I needed my solitude. She had built a wall between 2 families and convinced each side that the wall was the other one's preference. And for 10 years it had held, because why would either of us question it? She told you I wanted to stay home, I said. Every year, Patricia said. She was very consistent about it. She paused, choosing the word with the precision of a woman who had been thinking about this for days, convincing. She's good at that, I said. Yes. A pause. Robert, I am sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't give you back 10 Christmases. But I want you to know that Frank and we never would have accepted this arrangement if we had understood what it actually was. Her voice dropped lower. And I want you to know something else. There is always a seat for you at our table. Not as a courtesy, not as an apology, because you are those children's grandfather and you deserve to be treated as family. You always did. My throat tightened so hard it ached. I pressed my free hand flat against the kitchen table and concentrated on the sensation of the wood grain under my palm, solid and real and right there. Thank you, Patricia, I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. That means more than you know. Will you tell me? She started, then stopped. You don't have to answer this. But will you tell me if you're all right? I thought about it. About Marcus Webb's office and the 3 signed documents. About Lily's drawing in my wallet next to Margaret's photograph. About Dennis upstairs, still here, sleeping in the guest room and making coffee in the mornings and reading the newspaper at my kitchen table like he had always done it. I'm getting there, I said honestly. After I hung up, I sat at the table for a long time. The kitchen was quiet around me, the furnace ticking the refrigerator, humming the ordinary sounds of a house that was still mine, that would remain mine, that no one was going to take from me. Emily had built a 10-year lie so seamlessly that neither side had ever thought to look for a seam. She had not just excluded me from Christmas. She had excluded me from my own story, replaced the truth with a version that kept everyone comfortable and kept her in control, and she had maintained it for a decade without a single crack. Until now. That evening, I called Emily. One time. I had been carrying what I needed to say for 10 years. It didn't take long at all. I called Emily at 7 in the evening on January 9th. She picked up on the 3rd ring. I could hear a cooking show in the background, something with an upbeat host and audience applause, and the particular domestic sounds of an ordinary Thursday night in a house where nothing unusual had happened, and everything was fine. She said hello in the normal way, the way you answer the phone when you're not expecting anything in particular. I let her finish saying hello. Then I said what I had driven 20 minutes to Garden City and signed 3 documents to be able to say. Emily, I know about the guardianship paperwork. I know about Hargrove and Associates. I know you told the Moores for 10 years that I preferred to stay home at Christmas. And I know that Carol said no when you asked her to speak against me. The cooking show kept playing in the background. The upbeat host said something about reducing a sauce. Then Emily said, "Dad, let me explain." "I'm not calling for an explanation," I said. My voice was steady. Completely surprisingly steady, the way you are sometimes when you have been working toward something for long enough that the doing of it feels less like a confrontation and more like the completion of a sentence you started a long time ago. I just wanted you to know that I know. All of it, Dad. Her voice shifted, the warmth dropping away, something more urgent underneath it. I was trying to protect you. I was trying to make sure that if anything ever happened. You were trying to protect the house, I said. There's a difference. A pause. Then, that's not fair. Emily. I pressed my free hand flat on the kitchen table. You remembered me every Christmas, every single one for 10 years. You just never remembered me as family. The line went very quiet. The cooking show cut to a commercial. "Dad, please," I said, "I love you. I hope you figure out what that's supposed to mean." Then I hung up. She called back within 40 seconds. I watched her name light up the screen and kept my hands in my lap and let it ring. She called 4 more times over the next 20 minutes. Between the third and fourth calls, she called Dennis. I know because Dennis appeared in the kitchen doorway, his phone in his hand, and said, "She just called me. Wants to know if you're okay." He paused. "I told her you were fine and handling some things and that she should probably give you some space." He looked at me steadily. "Was that the right call?" "That was exactly the right call," I said. "Thank you, Dennis." He put his phone in his pocket and sat down across from me and didn't say another word, which was exactly what I needed from him and exactly what he knew how to give. The decision to leave Long Island had not arrived all at once. It had been coming in pieces since Christmas night, assembling itself quietly in the back of my mind while I sat on kitchen floors and in church pews and in lawyers' offices, and by the time I said it out loud to Dennis that evening, "I think I need to go somewhere new." It was less a decision than an acknowledgement of something that had already been made. "Where?" Dennis asked. I don't know yet," I said. "Somewhere I've never been. Somewhere nobody knows my name." Dennis thought about this for a moment. "Santa Fe," he said. "Margaret always wanted to go to Santa Fe." I looked at him. He was right. She had cut a picture out of a travel magazine once, the adobe walls and the mountain light, and stuck it to the refrigerator with a magnet. And we had always said, "Someday, someday," the way you say things when you believe you have all the time in the world. "Santa Fe," I said. Dennis drove back to Buffalo on the 10th and came back down on the 11th with his truck. And for 2 days, we packed the things that mattered into boxes and bags. Not much in the end. Closed my laptop, the books Margaret had given me over 30 years of Christmases and birthdays. The kitchen table stayed. It belonged to the house somehow, and the house was Carol's responsibility now. I took the fruit bowl. I took the photograph from the bedroom wall, the one from our anniversary trip to Maine, Margaret, laughing on a dock with the ocean behind her. And I took the photograph from the kitchen table. Her October face, the sunlight in her gray hair. On the morning of January 13th, I stood in the front doorway of the house on Long Island for the last time. Every room behind me was clean and empty and exactly as it should be. 35 years of living had passed through these walls, and what remained of it fit into the back of a rental car in the driveway. I took the key from my pocket. It was warm from being in my hand. I locked the front door. I stood on the front step for a moment, with both hands in my coat pockets, looking at the street I had shoveled every winter for 35 years, the oak trees I had watched grow from nothing into something that shaded the whole block in summer, the neighbor's porch light that had burned out 3 weeks ago and still hadn't been replaced. I took Margaret's photograph out of my coat pocket. I held it in both hands in the cold January air, and I looked at her face for a long time, at the laugh and the sunlight, and the absolute ease of a woman who always knew exactly where she belonged. "I'm taking up space now, Margaret," I said. My voice came out rough and low, barely above a whisper, barely enough to carry in the cold air. "I'm sorry it took me so long." Dennis was waiting at the curb and his truck engine running, not looking at me, giving me the thing I needed most in that moment, which was the privacy to say goodbye to 35 years without an audience. I walked down the porch steps and got into my rental car. At the security checkpoint at JFK, Dennis hugged me. It was the same awkward, slightly too long, entirely genuine hug. It had always been the hug of two men who had not grown up in a family that hugged easily, but had learned somewhere in their 60s that the time for being too proud to hold on to someone was running out. "Call me when you land," he said. "I will," I said. I walked through the security checkpoint without looking back. I had gotten very good at that. I landed in Santa Fe at 6 in the evening. The air was dry and cold and smelled like something I couldn't name, something clean and unfamiliar and entirely without history. I had never been there before. I stood outside the terminal with my bag at my feet and looked up at the sky, which was a color of blue I had never seen, over Long Island, deep and clear and going on forever. I picked up my bag and walked toward the taxi stand. I had somewhere to be. That was 14 months ago. The man at the table beside mine is still waiting for a real answer to his question. He has gone back to his newspaper patient, the way people are in small towns, not pushing, just leaving the door open in case I decide to walk through it. I appreciate that about Santa Fe. Nobody here is in a hurry. Nobody needs you to explain yourself before you are ready. I wrap both hands around my coffee mug, still warm, which is one of the things I love about this place. The coffee stays warm longer here than it ever did on Long Island. Something about the dry air, something about the altitude, something I haven't figured out yet, and have stopped trying to. And I look out the window at Canyon Road in the March morning light, and I think about what an honest answer would sound like. 14 months. Long enough to learn that the mountains turn pink at sunrise and gold at sunset, and a color I still don't have a name for in between, a kind of deep amber that only lasts about 4 minutes and is gone before you finish deciding whether you're imagining it. Long enough to find a watercolor class on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, taught by a woman named Ruth, who tells me I hold the brush too tight and is not wrong. Long enough to have a regular table at this coffee shop, and a regular order and a regular hour, which sounds like a small thing, and is not small at all when you have spent 10 years arranging your life around other people's schedules instead of your own. Small things matter when you are rebuilding something. I know that now in a way I didn't 14 months ago, when I stepped off a plane in an unfamiliar city with one suitcase and no plan beyond the address of the studio apartment I had rented online, and the knowledge that nobody here had ever heard of Robert Callahan. That anonymity felt terrifying for about the first week. After that, it felt like the first clean breath I had taken in a decade. Tommy calls every Sunday. He turned 10 in February, and his voice is starting to change just slightly, just at the edges, and it startles me every time. Not because I mind it, but because it reminds me how fast things move when you are paying attention. He wants to know if he can visit in the summer. I told him there is a room with his name on it, and I meant it, literally. I bought a second-hand frame at a shop on Guadalupe Street and put his name on a piece of cardboard and hung it on the guest room door. He laughed when I sent him a photograph of it. A real laugh, the kind that started somewhere deep in his chest and worked its way up, Margaret's kind of laugh. The kind that makes whatever room it's in feel 10 degrees warmer and whatever problem you were carrying feel 10 pounds lighter. He asked me once, about 3 months after I got here, whether I was lonely. I sat with that question for a moment before I answered, the way you sit with questions that deserve more than the first thing that comes to mind. Sometimes, I told him, but lonely here feels different than lonely there. How? He asked. Lonely there felt like something was missing, I said. Lonely here just feels like quiet. He thought about that for a long time. Then he said, I think I understand, Grandpa. And maybe he did. Tommy has always understood more than his age gives him credit for. Lily sent me a drawing last week. Not a figure standing outside in the cold looking in through a lit window. A man sitting in a chair beside a fireplace with a cup of something warm in his hands, and mountains visible through the window behind him. She had colored the mountains in careful layers, purple at the base, then pink, then a strip of white at the top that was either snow or sky, I couldn't tell. And it didn't matter, because either way, she had gotten it exactly right. On the back, in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, she had written 4 words. "You look happy, Grandpa." I stood in my kitchen for a long time holding that piece of paper. Then I put it on the refrigerator right next to Margaret's travel magazine picture of Santa Fe, the one Dennis found in a box when we were packing up the house, the one she had cut out and stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet 15 years ago and never taken down. Someday, she had always said. Someday. Here I am, Margaret. Someday finally arrived, and I brought your picture with me. Carol sends photographs of Long Island in the fall. The oak trees going orange and red along the street. I shoveled every winter for 35 years. The neighbor's porch light finally replaced. After all those months of being burned out, the frost on the parked cars that used to make my knees ache just looking at it. She calls every few weeks, not out of obligation, but out of the particular friendship that forms between people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side still standing. She is a good trustee and a better friend, and I do not take either of those things for granted, not even for a single day. Patricia Moore sends a card every few months. Her handwriting is small and precise, the handwriting of a woman who means what she writes and does not waste words. She always includes the same line at the bottom in the same careful script. "There is always a seat for you at our table, Robert." I keep every card in the drawer beside my bed. There are 4 of them now lined up in order. I do not reread them often. I do not need to. I know what they say. Dennis calls on the first Sunday of every month, regular as the mail, short as a telegram, entirely dependable, in the way that Dennis has always been entirely dependable when it actually counted. He does not ask me how I am doing in the way that requires a long answer. He asks me what I have been doing, which is different, and I tell him about the watercolor class and the coffee shop and the 4-minute color the mountains turn at sunset that I still cannot name. Last month, he told me he was thinking about driving out in the spring. I told him the guest room had 2 beds. He said he didn't need 2 beds. I said I knew that. We understood each other perfectly, the way brothers do when they have finally stopped pretending they do not need each other. Emily has not called. I have not called her either. I want to be honest about what that costs, because I think pretending it costs nothing would be its own kind of lie, and I have had enough of those to last me. There are days when that fact sits heavier than others, when I drive past a father and daughter having breakfast at the diner on Cerrillos Road, laughing about something with their heads bent close together, and my chest aches with a grief that is specific and real and does not go away just because I understand it. When Tommy says something on the phone that sounds so much like Emily did at his age that I have to breathe carefully for a moment before I respond. When I walk past the guest room with Tommy's name on the door and think about how many years it took to get to a place where there is a room waiting for someone, and how long it might be before there is one for his mother too. I don't pretend those days don't happen, but I also don't let them convince me that I made the wrong choice. Because the wrong choice was the one I made for 10 years, showing up when called, leaving when dismissed, arranging myself around a space that was never meant to hold me, and I know exactly what that felt like. I know it in my body, in the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent a decade making himself smaller and calling it love. The right choice does not always feel like relief. Sometimes it just feels like the only thing left that was true. I look over at the man with the newspaper. He has finished the front section and moved on to the sports pages, thoroughly unbothered by my long pause content, in the particular way of people who have learned not to need things to happen on any schedule but their own. He is drinking black coffee and reading about basketball, and he has not asked me a single follow-up question, which I respect enormously. Long enough, I tell him. He looks up. And then because it is March and the mountains are pink outside in the window, and my coffee is still warm, and the guest room has Tommy's name on the door, and Lily's drawing is on the refrigerator next to Margaret's magazine picture. And Dennis is probably already planning his route, I add, long enough to know I'm staying. He smiles a small, satisfied smile. The smile of a man who was not really waiting for the answer, but is glad to have it anyway, and goes back to his paper. I look out the window at the morning light on Canyon Road, at the adobe walls turning gold in the March sun, at the cottonwood trees just beginning to think about leaves, at the couple walking a dog the size of a small horse in the opposite direction from the one they came from, living their ordinary, unhurried Santa Fe morning. I think about what Margaret used to say. Take up space, Bobby. Promise me you'll take up space. I did not keep that promise for 6 years. I kept making myself smaller, kept rearranging myself to fit into rooms that didn't have a place for me, kept telling myself that was what love required. It doesn't. Love does not ask you to disappear. I know that now in the way you know things that cost you something to learn completely and without the option of unknowing it. The people who forget to set a place for you at the table do not get to decide where you eat. I set my own place now. Right here in Santa Fe with a coffee mug that stays warm and a window that lets in more light than I have seen in years, and a guest room door with a 10-year-old boy's name on it in cardboard and permanent marker. I took a long time to find this seat, but I am sitting in it now, and it was worth every single mile. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, don't be like me. Don't wait 10 years to ask for a seat at the table. Don't mistake someone's convenience for someone's love. The moment you realize you are only remembered when you are needed, pay very close attention. Father Brennan once told me that God sets a place for everyone at his table. I believe that now. And when the people closest to you consistently fail to do the same, that is not your fault, and it is not your burden to carry forever. My story is one of those family stories, revenge moments nobody plans for, but everyone who has lived it recognizes immediately. Walking away was not giving up. Walking away was the only way I finally arrived somewhere worth being. If you have lived your own version of these family drama revenge experiences, you already know the truth. I had to learn the hard way. Self-respect is not cruelty. Leaving is not abandonment. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is simply go. These family stories revenge and family drama revenge moments shape us. Let them teach you, not break you. And remember, these family stories, revenge, begin the moment you decide your life belongs to you. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs today. Share it and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end. A gentle note. Some stories on this channel include fictional elements created purely for reflection and inspiration. If this type of content isn't for you, that is completely okay. Choose what speaks to your heart. But if you are staying, welcome. The next story is already waiting for you.